Julian Blackwood's voice cut through the dining room like a blade through silk. "Mademoiselle," he said, each syllable dripping with theatrical precision, "pourriez-vous m'expliquer pourquoi un établissement de cette prétendue distinction emploie du personnel incapable de comprendre le français du XVIIIe siècle?" The question hung in the air. 20 tables, 40 pairs of eyes, one waitress whose hand had gone completely still on the neck of a $2,000 bottle of Bordeaux. Elena Vance had stopped breathing. 3 years ago, she had defended her linguistic thesis in front of the Sorbonne's most ruthless academics. She had translated manuscripts that made tenured professors weep. She had been called the most promising mind in her field. Now she stood in a white apron with wine stains on the hem, her father's medical bills folded in her back pocket, and a man who thought money could purchase superiority was using her native language as a weapon. The room had gone silent. His date, a woman in red who looked like she wanted to disappear, had her hand frozen halfway to her water glass. The manager was already moving toward their table, panic written across his face in corporate desperation. Julian leaned back in his chair, smiled, waited for her to crumble. He had no idea that the woman standing before him had spent 6 years studying the exact dialect he was butchering. He had no idea that every grammatical error he'd just made was already cataloged in her mind. He had no idea that his attempt at 18th century aristocratic French sounded like a child playing dress-up in his grandfather's clothes. And he certainly had no idea that in approximately 15 seconds, his entire world would shift on its axis. Elena's fingers tightened on the wine bottle. Her posture changed, just slightly, as something ancient and sharp slid behind her eyes. She opened her mouth. What happened next didn't just silence the table, it ended a man's empire, exposed a decades-old secret, and proved that real power has nothing to do with the weight of your wallet. But if you leave now, you'll never know how a waitress dismantled a billionaire CEO using nothing but the truth and flawless French. Subscribe, because what Elena said in the next breath made 40 people gasp, one man turn pale, and changed her life forever. 6 hours earlier, Elena Vance's feet had stopped sending pain signals somewhere around hour 9. Now they simply existed in a state of muted agony, the kind that made her wonder if cheap shoes could cause permanent nerve damage. She moved between tables with the practiced invisibility of furniture, refilling water glasses that hadn't been touched, clearing plates still half full of food that cost more than her weekly groceries. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered across the Hudson River like a promise she'd stopped believing in. L'Éclat occupied the 42nd floor of a Jersey City skyscraper, and every night she served people who looked at that skyline and saw their kingdom. Elena saw the city where she used to matter, before everything collapsed. 3 years ago, she'd walked the halls of the Sorbonne with her thesis tucked under her arm, defending theories on linguistic evolution to rooms full of academics who hung on her every word. Her professors had called her brilliant, revolutionary even. She'd had offers from universities across Europe, invitations to conferences, a future so bright it hurt to look at directly. Then her father's car had met black ice on a Vermont highway, and the future shattered like glass. The neurological damage was catastrophic. The bills were worse. Her mother had died when Elena was 12, so there was no one else. She'd withdrawn from her PhD program, packed her life into 2 suitcases, and moved back to the States to become her father's full-time caregiver. The academic world moved on without her. Apparently, brilliance had an expiration date, and hers had passed the moment she chose love over achievement. "Table 12 needs their wine," Robert's voice cut through her thoughts. The manager had perfected the art of looking stressed while maintaining a veneer of expensive calm. "It's the Blackwood reservation. Don't mess this up." Elena glanced toward the corner table where a man in a suit that probably cost more than her car was settling into his chair. His date, striking, uncomfortable, dressed in red, was already studying the menu with the intensity of someone trying to disappear into expensive paper. Julian Blackwood. She'd heard the name whispered through the kitchen, CEO of something predatory and successful, known for hostile takeovers and the kind of ruthlessness that made shareholders rich and employees disposable. Julian looked up as she approached, and his eyes did what rich men's eyes always did. They inventoried her worth in half a second and found the total disappointing. "Good evening," Elena said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pressing against her lungs. "My name is Elena. I'll be taking care of you tonight." "Will you?" Julian's tone suggested amusement at the concept. He glanced at his date, Clarissa, Elena had heard someone call her, with a smile that invited her to share the joke. "Darling, do you think she's capable of taking care of us? She looks like she's barely capable of standing." Clarissa's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy, but she said nothing. Elena's jaw tightened. She'd learned to swallow insults like other people swallowed coffee, quickly, frequently, without tasting them if she could help it. "Can I start you with something to drink?" "Something to drink," Julian repeated, as if testing the words for hidden incompetence. "How original. Tell me, do they train you to say that, or is it instinctive, like breathing but less essential?" The table beside them had gone quiet. Elena felt their attention like heat against her skin. "We have an excellent wine selection," she continued, reaching for the leather-bound list. "Our sommelier has curated. It's the Blackwood reservation. Do try not to bruise it while you're carrying it over. I know that's probably asking a lot." The words landed like small cuts, precise, meant to draw blood without leaving visible marks. Elena nodded once and turned away, her composure held together by nothing but practice and pride. Behind her, she heard Julian's voice drop to what he probably thought was a whisper, but was clearly meant to carry. "New Jersey. They scrape the bottom of the barrel and call it fine dining." Her hands were shaking when she reached the wine cellar. The bottle felt impossibly heavy as she pulled it from the rack. $2,000 of fermented grapes that this man would probably reject just to watch her walk back and forth like a trained dog. She'd seen it before. Men like Julian didn't come to restaurants to eat. They came to perform their superiority for audiences who didn't have the luxury of looking away. She checked the bottle's temperature. Perfect. Examined the label for any imperfection. Flawless. Carried it back upstairs with the kind of careful reverence that sommeliers spend years perfecting. Julian watched her approach with the expression of a cat watching a mouse struggle. And when Elena set the bottle on the table, when she began the careful ritual of presentation that her training demanded, Julian Blackwood smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who'd just decided exactly how he was going to break her for sport. Elena poured an ounce of wine into Julian's glass with hands that refused to shake despite the weight of his attention. The Bordeaux caught the light, deep crimson against crystal, probably the most beautiful thing on the table besides Clarissa's desperate desire to be anywhere else. Julian lifted the glass, swirled it with the kind of exaggerated precision that people used when they'd learned about wine from YouTube videos instead of vineyards, brought it to his nose, inhaled deeply, then set it down without tasting it. "Corked," he announced to the room. Elena's pulse stuttered. "Sir, I can assure you—" "Are you questioning my palate?" Julian's eyebrows rose with theatrical offense. "I've been collecting wine since before you were probably born. This bottle is corked. The tannins are compromised. Any educated person could smell it immediately." The neighboring tables had fully committed to eavesdropping now. Elena could feel their stares like pressure against her spine. "With respect," Elena said carefully, "I opened this bottle personally. There's no cork contamination. The seal was intact, and the wine has been stored at optimal temperature. If you'd like to taste it, I don't need to taste spoiled wine to know it's spoiled." Julian pushed the glass toward her with one finger, a gesture of dismissal so casual it might as well have been choreographed. "Bring me something that hasn't been ruined by amateur storage, and perhaps send someone more experienced to handle it, someone who understands the difference between vinegar and vintage." Clarissa had stared at her plate. Her cheeks had gone pink with second-hand embarrassment. Elena's training warred with her exhaustion. She should apologize, thank him for his feedback, retreat with the bottle and her dignity in tatters. That's what Robert would want, what the job required. But the wine wasn't corked. She knew it the way she used to know when a manuscript's translation was wrong, with the bone-deep certainty of expertise that couldn't be faked. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "this bottle retails for $2,000. It's a 2015 Pauliac from one of the finest chateaux in Bordeaux. The vintage was exceptional. If there were any cork taint, I would smell it immediately. What you're detecting is likely the earthy notes characteristic of left bank Cabernet, which can seem unfamiliar to palates more accustomed to—" Julian's laugh cut through her words like breaking glass. Did she just— He looked at Clarissa with delighted disbelief. "Did this waitress just attempt to educate me about wine? Darling, are you hearing this?" Clarissa's mouth opened, closed. She reached for her water glass instead of speaking. Julian stood. Not quickly, that would have suggested emotion. He rose with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who decided to make an example of something small and breakable. The restaurant held its breath. "You know what?" Julian's voice had gone soft, dangerous. "I've changed my mind. I don't want a different bottle. I want to understand something. I want to understand how someone with your limited qualifications feels confident challenging a customer's assessment. So let's make this educational." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, tapped something on the screen, then set it face down on the table. "Mademoiselle," and the French word sounded like an insult in his mouth. "Comprenez-vous le français? Do you understand French?" Elena's breath caught. Several diners shifted in their seats, recognizing the language, if not the intent. "Un petit peu," Julian continued, his accent crisp and practiced, probably honed in expensive immersion classes. "Ou est-ce que même les mots simples dépassent votre petite éducation de New Jersey? A little, or do even simple words exceed your small New Jersey education?" Clarissa had gone pale. "Julian," she whispered, "please don't." Julian's smile was razor-sharp. "I'm simply trying to communicate more clearly. Perhaps the problem is linguistic. Perhaps she's simply too limited to understand English properly, and I'm being cruel by expecting comprehension." He turned back to Elena, and his voice shifted into something older, more archaic, the formal, elaborate French of aristocracy, the dialect that had died with guillotines and revolution. "Dites-moi, petite servante, votre minuscule cerveau peut-il saisir la différence entre un vin de qualité et le vinaigre que vous tentez de me servir, ou bien votre éducation s'est-elle limitée à porter des travées et sourire pour les pourboires? Tell me, little servant, can your tiny brain grasp the difference between quality wine and the vinegar you're attempting to serve me, or has your education been limited to carrying trays and smiling for tips?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Most of the room wouldn't understand the specifics, but everyone understood the tone, contempt enwrapped in culture, wielded like a weapon. Robert was frozen by the bar, his expression caught between intervening and preserving the comfort of a man who probably spent more on a single meal than Elena earned in a month. Julian waited. He'd played his card, demonstrated his superiority. Now he wanted to watch her crumble under the weight of her own inadequacy. The silence stretched. And then Elena's posture changed. It was subtle, the way her spine straightened, the way her chin lifted, the way something behind her eyes shifted from exhaustion to something far more dangerous. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, precise, each word enunciated with the kind of academic perfection that Julian's expensive accent sounded like a tourist's first attempt at the language. "Monsieur Blackwood," she said, and the R rolled off her tongue with Parisian precision, "vous venez de commettre pas moins de 3 erreurs grammaticales dans votre attempt d'employer le français aristocratique du XVIIIe siècle. Mr. Blackwood, you just made no fewer than 3 grammatical errors in your attempt to employ 18th century aristocratic French. First, you used saisir instead of concevoir in that context, an error that suggests you learned French through an app rather than immersion. Second, your syntax was clumsy. A true aristocrat would never have placed the possessive adjective before the noun in that particular construction. And third," she paused, let the silence settle like snow. "Un véritable connaisseur de vin ne confondrait jamais les notes heurteuses d'un Pauliac mature avec la contamination du bouchon. Ce que vous sentez, c'est le terroir, c'est le sol, c'est exactement ce qui rend ce vin magnifique, mais bien sûr, il faudrait un palais éduqué pour l'apprécier." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Julian's face had drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Elena set the wine bottle gently on the table. Her hands were steady now, completely steady. "Souhaitez-vous que je vous apporte quelque chose d'autre, ou préférez-vous continuer cette conversation dans une langue que vous maîtrisez réellement? Would you like me to bring you something else, or would you prefer to continue this conversation in a language you actually master?" Somewhere near the window, an older gentleman in a vintage suit had set down his fork and was watching Elena with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood every word. Julian's hand had curled into a fist on the table. His jaw worked silently. And then his expression shifted into something cold and calculated and far more dangerous than simple embarrassment. He smiled. "Interesting," he said quietly, the word sharp as broken glass. "Check her apron, now." Robert materialized beside the table with the speed of a man who'd spent his entire career navigating the space between customer satisfaction and catastrophe. His face had gone carefully blank, the expression of someone pretending not to understand what was happening while understanding it perfectly. "Sir?" Robert's voice carried the practiced calm of crisis management. "Is there a problem?" "She just spoke to me in French." Julian hadn't taken his eyes off Elena. His voice was soft, almost conversational, which made it worse somehow. Fluent French. Archaic French, the kind of French you don't learn working in restaurants. "I'm not sure I understand your concern, sir." "My concern," Julian said, each word precisely placed, "is that I set my credit card on this table approximately 3 minutes ago, and now it's not here." The accusation landed like a gunshot. Elena's stomach dropped. "I didn't check her apron." Julian stood now, his full height and expensive suit lending weight to the words. "I don't make accusations lightly, but I'm also not stupid. A waitress who speaks 18th century French, who knows wine like a sommelier, who defends a bottle this aggressively?" He gestured at Elena with something like pity. "Someone's playing a role here, and I'd like to know why." "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding." Robert had his hands raised in a placating gesture that made Elena's chest tighten with panic. "Then she won't mind proving me wrong." Julian's smile was venomous. "Empty your pockets, your apron. Let's clear this up right now, and then I'll be happy to apologize for the confusion." The room had become a theater. 40 people leaning forward in their seats, forks suspended halfway to mouths, a story unfolding that they'd tell at dinner parties for months. Elena's hands moved to her apron pocket automatically, the gesture of someone with nothing to hide. Her fingers found the familiar shapes: order pad, pen, the folded medical bills she carried everywhere as a reminder of why she was here. No credit card. "There's nothing, Robert," Julian's voice cut through her words. "Call security. And while we're waiting, perhaps you could explain to me why your restaurant employs someone who's clearly overqualified for the position. Because in my experience, when someone's playing a part, they usually have something to hide." Robert's face had gone pale. His hands fluttered uselessly. I'll need to check the security footage, review the—" "Or," said a voice from the corner, quiet and absolutely certain, "or you could check his pocket." Every head turned. The older gentleman by the window was standing now, his vintage suit somehow making Julian's expensive ensemble look garish by comparison. He was thin, silver-haired, with the kind of weathered elegance that came from decades of not needing to prove anything. He walked toward their table with measured steps, and something in the room's energy shifted. Several diners had gone very still, recognition flickering across their faces. "Arthur Sterling," someone whispered. Elena's breath caught. Sterling Global, the Sterling Foundation. Arthur Sterling was a legend, the kind of old money that made new money look like pocket change. He disappeared from public life 15 years ago, and rumors about his whereabouts ranged from meditation retreats in Tibet to a quiet death that the family had never announced. He was standing 5 feet away, looking at Julian Blackwood with the mild interest of someone examining a particularly unimpressive insect. "Your card," Arthur said pleasantly, "is in your left breast pocket. You put it there when you ordered. I watched you do it." Julian's hand moved automatically to his jacket, froze. "That's impossible. I set it on the—" "You set your phone on the table," Arthur corrected gently, "face down, probably recording given how you kept glancing at it. The card went into your pocket. I have excellent vision for a man my age, and I was sitting directly across from you. Would you like me to describe the card's design? It's black, titanium, the kind that requires a 7-figure income to qualify for." The silence had weight now, pressure. Julian's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, denial, calculation, before landing on something that looked like cornered fury. His hand slid into his pocket, pulled out a black card. His voice had lost its certainty, "must have forgotten." "You must have." Arthur's tone remained pleasant, conversational, completely devastating. "Easy mistake. Although it does make the accusation of theft rather awkward, doesn't it?" Clarissa had her face in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking silently. "Now," Arthur turned his attention to Elena, and his expression softened into something that looked almost like recognition. "You said your name was Elena?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Elena Vance?" Her breath stopped. "Yes. How did you—" "I read your thesis once." Arthur's smile was small, genuine. 7 years ago, Linguistic Evolution and Social Power Structures in Post-Revolutionary France, submitted to the Sorbonne. Your advisor was Professor Claudine Beaumont, and she told anyone who would listen that you were the brightest mind she'd taught in 30 years. The room had gone from silent to stunned. Elena's voice cracked. "I withdrew from the program. My father had an accident, I know. I tried to find you afterward, but you'd vanished." Arthur's gaze shifted back to Julian, and the gentleness evaporated. "Which makes Mr. Blackwood's behavior this evening particularly illuminating. You see, Julian, I've been watching you for about 20 minutes now, watching you belittle staff, mock this young woman, use language as a weapon to make yourself feel powerful, and then, when she demonstrated expertise that made you uncomfortable, you attempted to destroy her livelihood with a false accusation. Julian had gone very pale. "Mr. Sterling, I assure you, this was a misunderstanding. It was a revelation." Arthur's voice remained soft, but something in it made Julian take a step backward. "Do you know how I built Sterling Global? Not by crushing people beneath me, not by using my education as a cudgel. I built it by recognizing talent when I saw it and having the basic human decency to treat people with respect." He pulled out his phone, tapped something on the screen. "Your company, Blackwood Ventures, currently carries approximately $40 million in debt financing. $12 million of that debt is held by Sterling Financial, one of my subsidiaries." Arthur looked up. "That loan is callable with 72 hours notice. I'm calling it. You have until Friday to refinance or liquidate." The color drained from Julian's face. "You can't." "I can. I am. Your credit line will be terminated by morning, and I'll make sure every serious lender in New York knows exactly why." Arthur slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Character matters, Mr. Blackwood. You just demonstrated that you have none." Julian's mouth opened and closed silently. His hands were shaking. Clarissa had stood up, was already gathering her clutch, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "We're done," she said quietly, speaking for the first time since the catastrophe began. She looked at Julian with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust. "We've been done for months, but I was too afraid to admit it. Thank you for making it easy." She walked toward the exit without looking back. Her red dress caught the light like fire as she disappeared down the stairs. Julian stood alone at the table, his titanium credit card still clutched in his hand like evidence of his own humiliation. He looked at Elena, at Arthur, at the room full of witnesses who would remember this moment forever. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps too fast to be dignified, too slow to be escape. The restaurant exhaled collectively. Elena realized she was still holding the wine bottle. Her hands had started shaking now that the adrenaline was draining away, replaced by something like shock. Arthur stepped closer, his expression gentle again. "Miss Vance," he said quietly, "I wonder if you might have time tomorrow to discuss something. I run a foundation dedicated to preserving historical texts. We translate, we archive, we make sure that important documents survive for future generations." He pulled out a card from his wallet, actual paper, thick and expensive. "We're looking for a director of linguistics, someone who understands that language is power, and power comes with responsibility. The salary is competitive, the work is meaningful, and your father would be eligible for our family health care program, which includes coverage at some of the finest neurological facilities in the country." Elena took the card with numb fingers. She stared at it, at the embossed letters, at the phone number that looked like it might connect to something impossible. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You defended a bottle of wine because it was the truth. You corrected a bully because he was wrong. And when faced with a false accusation that could have destroyed your life, you didn't attack. You simply stood there with dignity." He smiled. "That's exactly the kind of person I want running my foundation. Someone who knows that real power is being right, not being loud." He pulled his own card beside the wine bottle on the table. "Call me tomorrow. We'll discuss details." He started to turn away, then paused. "And Miss Vance, your father would be very proud of you tonight." Then Arthur Sterling walked back to his table, sat down, and resumed his dinner as if he hadn't just dismantled a man's empire and changed a woman's life with equal measures of grace. Elena stood in the center of L'éclat, holding a wine bottle and a business card, while Manhattan glittered across the river like it had been waiting for her all along. Robert approached carefully, his expression caught between awe and uncertainty. "So," he said finally, "do you still need this shift, or—" Elena looked at the card in her hand, at the skyline beyond the windows, at the space where Julian Blackwood had stood before his carefully constructed superiority collapsed under the weight of his own cruelty. "I'll finish tonight," she said quietly, "but I think I'm done after this." She set the wine bottle down, tucked Arthur's card carefully into her apron pocket beside her father's medical bills, and went back to work. The room watched her go, and for once she wasn't invisible. She was unforgettable. You've just witnessed the moment everything changed, but Elena's story isn't over, it's just beginning. What happened when she called that number? What did her father say when he finally woke up? And what became of Julian Blackwood after that night? Subscribe now, because the final chapter will break your heart in the best way possible. 6 months had passed since the night at Leclerc, but Elena still woke sometimes with the phantom weight of a wine bottle in her hands and Julian Blackwood's voice echoing in her ears. The dreams were fading now, replaced by mornings in an office with real windows, real light, real purpose. The Sterling Foundation occupied 3 floors of a Tribeca building that had been a warehouse once, before money and vision transformed it into something that looked like a library designed by people who understood that preservation didn't mean being stuck in the past. Elena's desk faced north, toward the river. On clear days, she could see Jersey City across the water, could pick out the building where Leclerc still served expensive wine to people who used money as a shield against their own emptiness. She'd learned that Julian Blackwood had filed for bankruptcy protection 60 days after that night. Blackwood Ventures dissolved in a mess of creditor claims and angry investors. The last she'd heard, he was in Dubai, trying to rebuild with what was left of his reputation. Clarissa had gotten engaged to a professor of marine biology, someone kind, the tabloids said, someone quiet. Elena rarely thought about either of them anymore. She was too busy translating a 14th-century manuscript about guild regulations in Lyon, a project that would have made her Sorbonne professors weep with envy. The foundation paid her well enough that she'd moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with actual heat and water pressure that didn't require prayer to function. She ate lunch at her desk most days, too absorbed in 16th-century verb conjugations to notice the time. But Thursdays were different. Thursdays, she left at 3 o'clock, drove north for 90 minutes, and spent the evening with her father. The Greenbrier facility didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a very expensive hotel that happened to employ neurologists instead of concierges. Private rooms, real art on the walls, therapy programs that cost more per month than Elena used to earn in a year, all covered by the Sterling Foundation's healthcare plan. Her father's room faced a garden. He sat in his wheelchair by the window most afternoons, watching birds fight over the feeder that Elena had installed 3 months ago at the nurse's suggestion. The stroke had stolen his speech, most of his mobility, and the sharp wit that used to make dinner conversations feel like verbal fencing matches. But he knew her. That much hadn't changed. "Hi, Papa." Elena set her bag on the chair and moved to kiss his forehead. His skin was warm, smelled like lavender soap the nurses used. "How was therapy today?" Her father's right hand moved, the one that still worked, and pointed at the communication board on his lap. The board had pictures, words, common phrases organized by the speech therapist into something that gave him back a fraction of what the accident had taken. He pointed to good, then to tired. "The nurse said you walked 15 feet this morning. That's amazing." Elena pulled the second chair closer and sat beside him. "Dr. Patel thinks you might be able to do stairs by Christmas. Actual stairs, Papa. Wouldn't that be something?" Her father's mouth moved in what might have been a smile. His left hand lay useless in his lap, but his right hand found hers and squeezed with surprising strength. Elena had learned to read the squeezes. 1 meant yes, 2 meant no, 3 meant I love you, though the therapist insisted that was probably Elena projecting emotion onto involuntary muscle spasms. Elena knew better. They sat in comfortable silence while the afternoon light shifted toward evening. Elena told him about work, about the manuscript she was translating, about the graduate student she was mentoring who reminded her of herself at 23, bright and terrified and brilliant, about the conference invitation she'd received last week, her first since leaving the Sorbonne, about how Arthur Sterling stopped by her office yesterday to see if she wanted to co-author a paper on linguistic preservation in the digital age. Her father listened with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent 6 months relearning how to communicate with nothing but gestures and a laminated board full of pictures. When she finished, he pointed at the board. Proud. The word blurred as Elena's eyes filled. She blinked rapidly, laughing a little. I just translate old documents, Papa. It's not exactly saving the world. Her father's hand moved again, more insistently this time, pointed at you, then at strong, then at proud. It was just one night, one man who needed to be told he was wrong. Anyone would have. Her father's hand squeezed hers 3 times. I love you. The tears came properly now, sliding down her cheeks in a way that would have embarrassed her 6 months ago. But she'd learned that strength didn't mean never breaking, it meant breaking and still showing up the next day. I love you too, she whispered. They sat together while the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the garden in shades of amber and rose. The birds abandoned the feeder. The nurse came by to check vitals and left them alone again, sensing something she was professional enough not to interrupt. Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Arthur. Board meeting moved to Tuesday. Gives you extra time for the Lyon manuscript. Try not to work all weekend. She smiled. Typed back, no promises. Put the phone away. You know what's strange? Elena said after a while. Julian Blackwood had all that money, all that power. He could buy whatever he wanted, go wherever he pleased. And he was still so empty. Like he needed everyone else to be small so he could feel big. Her father pointed at the board. You, then different. I spent 3 years being invisible, moving through rooms like furniture, taking insults because I needed the paycheck. I thought power was something you earned by not causing problems, by being quiet, by knowing your place. She looked at her father, at his weathered face and patient eyes. But that night I realized something. Julian Blackwood had all that money, all that power. He could buy whatever he wanted, go wherever he pleased, and he was still so empty, like he needed everyone else to be small so he could feel big. Her father pointed at the board. You, then different. I spent 3 years being invisible, moving through rooms like furniture, taking insults because I needed the paycheck. I thought power was something you earned by not causing problems, by being quiet, by knowing your place. She looked at her father, at his weathered face and patient eyes. But that night I realized something. Julian had money. He didn't have power. Power was always mine, in my mind, in my knowledge, in the choice to speak or stay silent. She squeezed his hand gently. Power was loving you enough to give up Paris. That was the strongest thing I ever did, even if it looked like surrender. Her father's eyes were bright. He pointed at proud again, then at always. Always proud. Elena stayed until visiting hours ended, until the nurse came by with gentle insistence that Mr. Vance needed his rest. She kissed her father's forehead, promised to call tomorrow, and walked through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and hope. The drive back to Brooklyn took longer than usual. Traffic snarled on the bridge, giving Elena too much time to think, to remember, to wonder what her life would look like now if she'd stayed silent that night, if she'd let Julian Blackwood win. Her apartment was dark when she arrived. She flipped on lights, dropped her bag by the door, and moved to the window that faced Manhattan. The skyline glittered across the East River, same as always, different than before. She'd spent 3 years staring at that skyline from the other side, from Jersey City, from the outside looking in, pressing her face against glass she'd never touch. Now she stood on the inside, and the view looked exactly the same. Except she'd learned something Julian Blackwood never would. The skyline didn't care who was looking at it. It didn't validate you or diminish you or notice you at all. It was just light and steel and human ambition reaching towards something bigger. What mattered was knowing you belonged there, not because you'd bought your way in, not because someone else's humiliation made you feel tall, but because you'd earned it, in hospital rooms and double shifts and choosing dignity over surrender, in defending truth when lies were easier, in the quiet knowledge that real power, the kind that actually mattered, had nothing to do with credit cards or corner offices or the ability to hurt people in expensive restaurants. Elena pulled out her phone and opened the photos, scrolled back 6 months to the one she'd taken that night after her shift ended. A business card, simple, elegant. Arthur Sterling, Sterling Foundation. Below it, handwritten in fountain pen, "Call me. You deserve better than this." She called. The world had shifted. And now, standing in her apartment with Manhattan glowing like a promise that she'd finally stopped waiting for permission to touch, Elena Vance understood exactly what Arthur Sterling had seen that night. Not a waitress who spoke French, a woman who'd always had power. She just needed one cruel man and one kind one to remember it. Elena closed the curtains, made tea, and settled at her desk with the Lyon manuscript. The 14th century French was dense, challenging, beautiful in its precision. She lost herself in translation, in the puzzle of making old words sing in modern language. At some point her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Clarissa. I hope this isn't weird. Arthur gave me your number. I wanted to say thank you. You saved me that night too. Coffee sometime?" Elena stared at the message for a long moment, then smiled and typed back, "Coffee sounds perfect." She set the phone aside and returned to her work, to the ancient words waiting for her attention, to the life she'd built from the ruins of the one she'd lost. Outside, Manhattan kept glittering. Inside, Elena Vance was finally home. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Elena was reviewing proofs for the journal article she was publishing with Arthur. His name lit up her screen, and she answered with the kind of ease that came from a year of collaboration and mutual respect. "Elena," Arthur's voice was warm, "do you have a moment?" "For you? Always." She set down her red pen and leaned back in her chair. Through her office window, the October sun was turning the Hudson River into hammered gold. "I had an interesting conversation yesterday," Arthur said, "with the Dean of Linguistics at Columbia. They're creating an endowed chair position, full professor, tenure track, focus on historical linguistics and preservation. The funding is coming from the Sterling Foundation, which means I have considerable input on the appointment." Elena's breath caught. "They asked me if I knew anyone qualified," Arthur continued. "Anyone brilliant enough to hold the position, anyone with the kind of mind that comes along once in a generation." "Elena!" "I told them I knew exactly one person." His voice carried a smile. "Someone who walked away from her PhD to take care of her father. Someone who spent 3 years serving wine to people who treated her like furniture. Someone who stood in a restaurant and chose truth over survival, even when it might have cost her everything." Elena's throat had gone tight. "The position starts next fall," Arthur said quietly. "If you want it, no pressure. The foundation is happy to keep you as long as you'll have us. But I thought you should know, Paris isn't the only place that recognizes brilliance when it sees it." Elena looked at the manuscript on her desk, at the medieval French she'd been translating all morning, at the life she'd built in the aftermath of catastrophe, at the skyline beyond her window that had stopped being a symbol of everything she'd lost and become simply the place where she lived. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Take all the time you need." Arthur paused. "How is your father?" "Walking." Elena's voice broke slightly with pride. 30 feet yesterday. The therapist says he might regain enough speech for simple sentences by Christmas. That's wonderful. Give him my regards. After they hung up, Elena sat in the October light and thought about choices, about the night a cruel man tried to break her and accidentally reminded her who she was, about how power had never left her, she'd just forgotten how to use it, about how sometimes the worst moments of your life were just preludes to the best ones. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her father's facility. Elena's heart jumped. Calls during the day usually meant something was wrong. "Miss Vance?" The voice was excited, breathless. "I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I thought you'd want to know immediately. Your father just spoke. Actual words. Clear words." Elena stood so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "What did he say?" "He was looking at a picture of you on his nightstand," and Elena could hear the smile in her voice. "And he pointed at it and said, very clearly, 'My daughter, Elena, proud.'" The tears came instantly, completely, without permission or apology. "I'm on my way," Elena managed. "Tell him I'm coming. Tell him—" "He knows," the nurse said gently. "He knows." Elena grabbed her bag and jacket, sent Arthur a quick text, "Family emergency, good news," and was out the door before she remembered to lock it. She drove north with her heart hammering and her vision blurred, and her father's first words in 3 years echoing in her mind like a benediction. "My daughter, Elena, proud." The Greenbrier Facilities garden was in full autumn color when she arrived. Her father was in his usual spot by the window, but his posture was different, straighter, alert. When she saw her rush through the door, his face, that weathered, beloved face, broke into a smile that reached his eyes. "Papa!" Elena dropped to her knees beside his wheelchair and took both his hands. The left one was still weak, still mostly useless, but he was gripping back with both now, fighting with everything he had to hold on. His mouth worked, struggled, then, "Elena." Her name, in his voice, rough and halting and absolutely perfect. Elena pressed her forehead against his hands and wept like she was 23 again, newly motherless, terrified of loss. But these were different tears. These were the kind that meant healing. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here, Papa." His right hand lifted, trembling with effort, and touched her hair, stroked it the way he used to when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "Proud," he said, clearer this time. "So proud." Elena looked up at him through tears and saw her father looking back, really looking, present and aware, and fighting his way back from the darkness one syllable at a time. "I saved you," she said. "That night, all those nights. You were the reason I stayed strong, the reason I kept going. Everything good in my life exists because I refused to give up on you." Her father shook his head slowly, laborious but deliberate. "You, strong, always, were." And Elena understood. She'd spent 3 years thinking she'd sacrificed everything for him, given up Paris and prestige and her brilliant future to push his wheelchair and count pills and survive. But he'd known the truth all along. She hadn't given up anything. She'd chosen love over ambition, and that choice was her power, the same power that let her stand in a restaurant and speak truth to cruelty, the same power that rebuilt her life from ruins, the same power that brought her here, to this moment, to her father speaking her name after 3 years of silence. I love you, Elena said. Her father squeezed her hands 3 times. I love you too. They sat together in the autumn light while the sun traced patterns across the floor and the world kept turning outside. A tea bringer brought tea. The physical therapist poked her head in, saw them, and quietly retreated. Even the birds seemed to understand that something sacred was happening in this room. Eventually, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Arthur. Good news? She typed back with one hand, the other still holding her father's. The best. He spoke. He said my name. Arthur's response came immediately. That deserves celebration. Take the rest of the week. I'll handle the journal proofs. Elena pocketed her phone and looked at her father, who dozed off with his hand still gripping hers. His breathing was even, peaceful. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair and made him look dignified, wise, exactly like the man who'd raised her to believe that knowledge was power and kindness was strength. She thought about Julian Blackwood, about his titanium credit card and his borrowed French and his desperate need to make everyone around him feel small. She wondered if he'd learned anything from his fall. If bankruptcy had taught him what cruelty cost, if he'd discovered that you could own the world and still have nothing worth keeping. She hoped so, not because she wanted revenge. That appetite had died the night Arthur Sterling called his loans and dismantled the bully's empire with nothing but quiet certainty, but because she'd learned something that year that she wanted everyone to understand. Power wasn't something you took from others. It wasn't money or position or the ability to hurt people in expensive restaurants. Power was knowing who you were when the world tried to tell you otherwise. Power was choosing truth even when lies were safer. Power was love that survived catastrophe and emerged stronger on the other side. Power was her father's hand in hers, squeezing 3 times. I love you. Elena stayed until visiting hours ended, until the evening nurse gently reminded her that Mr. Vance needed his rest. She kissed his forehead, promised to come back tomorrow, and walked through corridors that no longer smelled like despair. The drive back to Brooklyn felt different, lighter, like she'd been carrying a weight for 3 years and only now realized she'd set it down. Her apartment welcomed her with warm light and the manuscript waiting on her desk. But instead of diving back into work, Elena poured a glass of wine, nothing expensive, just something honest, and stood at her window looking at Manhattan. The skyline glittered, same as always. But Elena Vance was different. She'd been broken and rebuilt, lost and found, invisible and seen. She'd stood in the ruins of her dreams and built something better from the wreckage. And now, with her father's voice still echoing in her ears and Arthur's job offer waiting for her answer, Elena understood exactly what she wanted. Not revenge, not vindication. Just this, a life built on truth, work that mattered, love that endured, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when cruelty came calling, she'd stood her ground and spoken back in perfect French. The phone rang. Clarissa's name flashed on the screen. "Hey," Elena answered, smiling. "You're calling late." "I know, Clarissa's voice was breathless with excitement. "I'm getting married next June, and I want you to be there. I know we've only known each other a year, but you changed my life that night. You showed me what strength looked like. So will you come, please?" Elena laughed, genuine and warm. "I'd be honored." "Thank you. God, thank you." Clarissa paused. "Have you heard anything about Julian?" "Not in months. Last I heard, he was in Dubai." "He's back," Clarissa said quietly. "Saw him at a charity gala last week. He's different, quieter. He actually apologized to me. Can you believe that? Julian Blackwood apologizing?" Elena said nothing for a moment, processing this information. "Do you think people can change?" Clarissa asked. I think catastrophe gives us a choice. We can learn from it, or we can let it make us bitter. I hope he chose the first one. You're kinder than I am. I'm just tired of carrying anger. It's too heavy. They talked for another 20 minutes, about Clarissa's fiancé, about Elena's father, about the strange ways that one terrible night had redirected both their lives towards something better. After they hung up, Elena returned to her desk and the Lyon manuscript. She worked until midnight, until her eyes blurred and the medieval French started to look like modern poetry. Before bed, she typed an email to Arthur. Thank you for thinking of me for the Columbia position. I'm deeply honored. Can we discuss it over coffee this week? I have some questions about balancing the professorship with my foundation work. I'm not ready to choose between them yet. Maybe I don't have to. She hit send, brushed her teeth, and climbed into bed with a book she'd been trying to finish for 3 months. But before she opened it, she allowed herself one more moment to remember. That night at L'Eclat, the weight of the wine bottle, Julian's sneer, the moment she'd decided that silence cost more than speech, the look on his face when she'd answered in perfect French, the way the room had shifted, the way she'd felt her power return, not bestowed by Arthur Sterling or validated by applause, but simply remembered, reclaimed, hers all along. Elena closed her eyes and thought about her father saying her name, about Clarissa finding love, about Arthur offering her a future, about Julian learning, maybe, that cruelty had consequences, about how one night could fracture your life and how you could spend the next year gathering the pieces and building something beautiful from the shards. She fell asleep smiling, and Manhattan kept glittering beyond her window, same as always, waiting for tomorrow.